7 weeks. That is how long it has been since the United States launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. 7 weeks of bombing, 7 weeks of threats, 7 weeks of ultimatums about civilizations dying and enemies being blown to hell. 7 weeks of the most powerful navy on Earth positioned at the entrance of a 34-kilometer waterway. And as of today, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has announced that the Strait of Hormuz has returned to its previous state, meaning the IRGC is back in full control, not open, controlled by Iran. This is not a ceasefire breakdown. This is not a negotiating setback. This is a structural outcome, and it was visible weeks ago to anyone looking at the right variables. The question I want to answer today is not whether America will eventually force the strait open. The question is why the most expensive military machine in human history has been unable to reopen a waterway it declared a strategic priority on day one of this war. That answer tells you something about American power that the Pentagon will not say out loud, that the White House cannot admit, and that the mainstream media is structurally incapable of explaining in 30-second clips. I want to walk you through the game theory, the structural history, and the geography that produced this outcome. Because when you understand these three forces, the IRGC's announcement today is not a surprise. It is a conclusion. If you are learning something here, please hit subscribe. We have a lot of ground to cover today. Let me start with the timeline, because the sequence of events is itself the argument. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Within hours, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. On March 3rd, Trump said the Navy would begin escorting tankers through the strait as soon as possible. By March 19th, the United States began a military campaign specifically designed to reopen it. In late March, Trump threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants if the strait was not opened within 48 hours. He postponed that ultimatum, then issued it again, then postponed it again. On April 8th, a 2-week ceasefire was agreed, with strait reopening as a stated condition. Iran controlled traffic and charged tolls instead. Peace talks in Islamabad ran for 21 hours on April 11th and 12th and collapsed. On April 13th, the United States announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Iran responded by declaring the strait had returned to its previous state of strict IRGC control. Count the steps. The first ultimatum to reopen the strait came on March 3rd. Today is April 18th, 46 days, zero reopening. Now, most people watching this story ask a simple question. Why does Iran not just back down? The United States has aircraft carriers, destroyers, stealth bombers, 10,000 personnel deployed to the operation. Iran's military has been degraded by weeks of airstrikes. The rational calculation from a pure power analysis seems to favor American demands. But here is the reality. That analysis misunderstands what kind of conflict this actually is. And this is where most people's analysis completely breaks down. The first structural force is what military strategists call area denial. And it is the reason geography defeats firepower in the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It is flanked on one side by Iran. Iran does not need to project power into the strait. Iran is the strait. Every ship that transits the waterway passes within range of IRGC missile systems, drone launch sites, fast attack boats, and mine-laying capability positioned on territory Iran has controlled for decades. The United States can destroy Iranian military installations. The United States cannot remove Iran from its own coastline. Here is the precise military problem. Iran lost track of some of the mines it laid in the strait. This was confirmed by reporting in late April. Iran cannot fully open the strait even if it wanted to, because it cannot safely tell the US Navy where all the mines are without revealing the extent of its own mining operation and the locations of remaining munitions. And the US Navy cannot safely transit the strait to clear mines while Iran retains anti-ship missile capability on the northern shore. The mine clearance operation announced on April 13th requires the absence of Iranian threat. Iran's presence makes that absence impossible to guarantee. The second structural force is what I call the leverage inversion, and this is the mechanism that the White House has not publicly acknowledged. Conventional military logic says the stronger party imposes its will on the weaker party. The United States is categorically stronger than Iran by every conventional military metric. But the Strait of Hormuz is not a conventional battlefield. It is a choke point. And in choke point conflicts, the party that controls the choke point has structural leverage that is independent of overall military strength. Keep this specific number in the back of your mind because we are coming back to it. 20%. That is the share of global oil trade that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Not American oil, global oil. India draws 60% of its energy from this corridor. China draws 40%. Japan draws 75%. These countries are not parties to the US-Iran conflict, but they are directly affected by whether the strait is open or closed, and their need creates Iran's leverage. Iran does not need to defeat the United States militarily. Iran only needs to make the cost of continued closure fall on parties other than Iran. Every day the strait remains closed. India loses revenue. Japan faces energy rationing. South Korea scrambles for alternatives. These countries apply pressure to Washington, not to Tehran. They ask America to solve a problem America created, because they cannot pressure Iran directly without becoming parties to a conflict they want no part of. This is why Trump's statement that other nations should fend for themselves on energy did not land the way he intended. He said it on March 31st, telling countries struggling to get fuel to deal with it themselves because the United States would not help. Within days, he reversed course and demanded that NATO, China, France, Japan, South Korea, and others send warships to help keep the strait open. The reversal was not a political mistake. It was a structural acknowledgement. The United States cannot reopen the strait unilaterally because the cost of failure falls not just on America, but on the entire global economy. And that global cost gives America's allies leverage over American policy that is genuinely uncomfortable for an administration that ran on America first. The IRGC's announcement today is a masterclass in this mechanism. By declaring the strait has returned to its previous state of IRGC control, Iran is saying something precise. The ceasefire did not change the fundamental power relationship in this waterway. The blockade did not change it. The 50-plus days of military operations did not change it. We control who passes. That is the previous state, and that is the current state. The third structural force is what structural history shows us about the limits of naval blockades as coercive instruments. I want to take you to the American Civil War. In 1861, the Union Navy imposed a blockade on Confederate ports. The stated goal was to strangle the Confederacy economically by cutting off its cotton exports and preventing arms imports. The blockade was declared within days of Fort Sumter. It took the Union Navy years to make it effective. In the early months, blockade runners routinely transited Confederate ports. British ships carrying arms entered and left Charleston, Savannah, and Mobile, while Union warships were supposedly enforcing the blockade. The Confederacy did not collapse from the blockade alone. It collapsed from a combination of military defeat on land, internal economic failure, and the cumulative weight of 4 years of total war. The lesson structural history teaches about naval blockades is precise. A blockade is not an instant coercive tool. It is a long-term attrition instrument. Its effectiveness depends on the target's inability to find alternatives, and on the enforcer's ability to maintain pressure indefinitely, without the cost of enforcement exceeding the benefits of compliance. In the Strait of Hormuz in April of 2026, both of those conditions are structurally absent. Iran has alternatives. Iran's own oil exports continue. Iran is selling crude to China at a discount through the shadow fleet. China is explicitly not complying with the blockade spirit, with sanctioned Chinese-linked tankers having already transited the waterway. And the costs of American enforcement are rising, not falling. Britain and Spain refused to join the blockade. France organized a separate maritime conference in Paris, specifically outside Washington's framework. Italy's Giorgia Meloni, one of Trump's closest European allies, publicly criticized the blockade as a threat to the ceasefire. The enforcement coalition is shrinking, while the enforcement requirement is not. Now, I want to address the argument that is most commonly made in defense of the American position, because it deserves a serious answer before I show you why it ultimately fails. The argument goes like this. The blockade is working. The Pentagon says it has turned back 13 ships. CENTCOM says it has completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran by sea. Iran is losing $400 million a day in revenue. The pressure will force Iran to negotiate. The ceasefire is still holding. A deal is possible before April 22nd when the 2-week window expires. Every element of this argument is factually accurate, and it completely misses the structural reality. Here is the reality. Turning back 13 ships proves the blockade functions as a mechanical interdiction. It does not prove the blockade is achieving its strategic objective, which is forcing Iran to relinquish control of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has now declared that it has retaken that control, not despite the blockade, through the blockade. Because the blockade gave Iran a justification for restoring strict IRGC management of strait traffic that the ceasefire had nominally, if never actually, relaxed. Iran's logic is precise. You imposed a blockade on our ports. We have therefore reimposed full control of the strait. The previous state is the current state. This is game theory at its most elegant. Iran took an American coercive action and used it as cover for reasserting the position it wanted to hold anyway. The blockade did not weaken Iran's leverage in the strait. It gave Iran a legal and rhetorical basis for strengthening it. Real American families are paying over $4 a gallon for gasoline right now, the highest since the height of the pandemic. Real Japanese companies are rationing power. Real Indian fertilizer manufacturers have cut output because LNG prices have made production uneconomical. The question these families and companies are asking is not whether the blockade is mechanically functioning. The question is whether it is producing the outcome it was announced to produce. And the IRGC statement today is Iran's answer to that question. Now I want to walk you through the 4 things to watch, because the next 72 hours are genuinely consequential. The first thing to watch is whether the ceasefire holds past April 22nd. The 2-week window expires in 4 days. A second round of negotiations has been discussed but not confirmed. If no deal is reached and the ceasefire expires, the IRGC's announcement today transforms from a diplomatic statement into an operational order. Strict management of the strait with no ceasefire in place means active enforcement of Iranian control, including against vessels that have not sought Iranian permission. The escalation scenario from that point is not theoretical. It is the scenario that every shipping insurance company is already pricing in. It is the scenario that Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba warned about when he said Japan runs out of oil in 8 to 10 months if the strait closes permanently. The difference between a diplomatic stalemate and a civilizational emergency is the expiration of a 2-week piece of paper on April 22nd. The second thing to watch is whether any U.S. Navy vessel physically attempts to transit the northern route through the strait, the route Iran controls. The American blockade applies to ships entering and leaving Iranian ports. It does not, per CENTCOM's own statement, impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting to and from non-Iranian ports. But Iran's announcement of strict control applies to all strait traffic regardless of destination. These two positions are not compatible. They are a collision waiting to happen in a 34-kilometer waterway where Iranian patrol boats and American warships are already operating in close proximity. Military analysts have noted that routine encounters, radio warnings, course changes, or aggressive maneuvers by smaller boats can be misread in seconds. The margin for error in that waterway is measured in nautical miles that can be covered in minutes. The moment those two legal frameworks physically collide, the ceasefire is over, and the question of what comes next has no established answer. The third thing to watch is China's next move. China has made clear it considers the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Chinese-linked tankers have already transited. Beijing has 97% of Iran's oil on water heading to Chinese ports, according to maritime tracking data. If China formally signals that it will not observe the blockade, and Beijing's statement gives it every rhetorical basis to do exactly that, then the blockade becomes unenforceable in practice. You cannot interdict Chinese tankers without triggering the US-China escalation scenario that makes the May summit impossible, the rare earth clocks start counting down faster, and the entire diplomatic architecture of 2026 collapse simultaneously. China understands this. The IRGC understands this. The question is whether Washington has fully priced it in. Watch what China's foreign ministry says in the next 48 hours. Watch whether any Chinese-flagged or Chinese-linked vessel receives a U.S. Navy warning in international waters. That interaction, or the absence of it, will tell you more about the actual leverage balance than any press conference. The fourth thing to watch is the language coming out of the White House about the strait's status. Trump has already said the strait is completely open, while simultaneously saying the blockade will continue. Both statements cannot be true at the same time. The contradiction between those two claims is not a communications problem. It is a structural reflection of the fact that the United States does not control whether the strait is open. Iran controls that, and Iran today said it has returned to controlling it strictly. Watch whether the administration acknowledges this gap or continues to paper over it with assertions that are contradicted by real-time shipping data. The language Washington uses in the next 72 hours will signal whether it is moving toward a negotiated exit from the stalemate or doubling down on a coercive posture that the structural analysis suggests cannot produce the outcome it is designed to produce. The structural conclusion from all of this is not that the United States has lost the Iran war. The military campaign achieved its stated objectives of degrading Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure. The structural conclusion is more specific and more important for understanding where American power actually sits in 2026. The United States has been unable to reopen the Strait of Hormuz because the strait is not a battlefield, it is a geography. And geography does not respond to threats, ultimatums, or blockades the way an enemy army responds. Geography simply is. Iran is simply there. The IRGC boats are simply on that coastline. The mines are simply in that water. The missile systems are simply pointed at ships entering that channel. The most powerful navy in the world has been unable to change those facts in 46 days. The IRGC announced today that it does not expect those facts to change on American timelines. There is a line from a commander in the Peloponnesian Wars that I keep returning to. When Sparta was asked why it had not simply overwhelmed Athens by force early in the conflict, the Spartan admiral replied, "Because the sea belongs to whoever sits beside it." Athens sat beside the sea. Athens controlled it. Not because of the size of its fleet alone, because of the permanence of its position. Iran sits beside the Strait of Hormuz. It has sat there for centuries. The permanence of that position is not changed by an aircraft carrier group. It is changed only by a political settlement that Iran accepts. And that settlement has not been reached. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. I might be wrong about whether a deal is reached before April 22nd. I might be wrong about whether China decides to formally defy the blockade. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. Save this analysis. Come back in 72 hours. Check whether the ceasefire held. Check whether any American warship transited the northern route. Check whether China made a move. The answers will tell you whether the structural forces I described here are still operating or whether something genuinely changed. If you want to follow this analysis as it develops, hit subscribe. Because the story of who controls the Strait of Hormuz is the story of who controls the global economy. And that story is not over.